This documentary is about Apollo 13. Apollo 13 was an amazing adventure in space that shows how teamwork works. This mission happened 48 years ago, but is still one of the most famous space missions in history that NASA launched. In this documentary, you will learn how 3 astronauts worked hard to get back onto Earth with a broken space capsule. What had happened was an oxygen tank explosion occurred, which caused a malfunction in the spacecraft, and the crew was forced to orbit the moon and return to Earth. This mission did not turn out as planned and didn't end up landing on the moon, but it did successfully land back on Earth. The Apollo 13 mission that happened on April 11, 1970 was a successful failure. This mission's objective was to land on the moon but had to abort after an oxygen tank erupting. This mission is important because it affected future missions and is one of the greatest NASA conducted missions in history. There were many missions, and the first was Apollo 1. Apollo 1 happened on February 21st, 1967. The crew members were practicing in the space module and getting ready for takeoff when a fire broke out, killing all 3 lives in the space module. There was no Apollo 2 or 3. The next planned mission was Apollo 4. Apollo 4 was an unmanned launch and launched on November 9, 1967. Apollo 4 was the first launch of Saturn V rocket, and the mission was very successful. The purpose for Apollo 4 was when the fires of Apollo 1 struck, they needed to redo the launch and practice the components they weren't able to do because of the Apollo 1 disaster. Apollo 5 came later on and was another unmanned mission. It launched on January 22, 1968. The purpose was for lunar module practice for when it would detach and land on the moon. Then Apollo 6 came and launched on April 4, 1968, in another unmanned mission. It wasn't the most perfect mission with engine failures erupting. The mission was not aborted. This mission was much more important to history because Martin Luther King died this very day. Apollo 7 was the first manned mission that launched into space. Its crew members were Wally Schirra, Don Easley, and Walter Cunningham. It was launched into space on October 11, 1978. It wasn't a mission meant to go on the moon, it just orbited the Earth 163 times. Saturn IB was launched because the spacecraft didn't have a lunar module. Apollo 7 was the first American space mission live on television. Apollo 8 was when NASA was ready to send a practice lunar module onto the moon. On December 21, 1978, Apollo 8 launched. Inside Apollo 8 was Frank Burnham, James Lovell, and William Anders. They launched Apollo 8 with a fake lunar module, and the 3 crew members were the first to orbit the moon. Contact with mission control was lost when the spacecraft was on the other side of the moon. Apollo 8 made 10 orbits before splashing down on Earth, 6 days and 3 hours later, which was December 27, 1978. Apollo 9 was yet another manned mission. The crew members were James McDivitt, David Scott, and Russell Schweickart. It was another Earth orbit and was launched on March 3, 1969. This mission was to test the lunar module since it wasn't ready for Apollo 8. Lunar module went 101 miles away from command module. It soon entered Earth atmosphere and splashed down. Apollo 10 was the final test for the moon landing. The cast for Apollo 10 was Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan. Apollo 10 launched on May 18, 1969. It went as close as 15.6 kilometers to the moon, but didn't have equipment to land. Soon it reconnected and splashed down on May 26, 1969. Apollo 10 soon meant that the testing for sending a man on the moon was done. 2 months later, Apollo 11 happened and the first steps on the moon were taken. The crew was Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, and Michael Collins. Apollo 11 was launched on July 16, 1969. It took 3 days to get to the moon. They landed on July 21, 1969. This mission was all captured on live television from a camera attached on the side of a lunar module. The lunar module reconnected with the command module and splashed down on Earth on July 24, 1969. Apollo 12 took off 4 months later on November 14, 1969. The crew was Pete Conrad, Richard Gordon, and Alan Bean. The Saturn V rocket got struck with lightning while during the launch. Soon the lunar module disconnected from the command module in space and landed where planned on the moon. They splashed down on November 24, 1969. Jack Swigert had been an astronaut since 1966 and was a part of the crew for Apollo 7 as well as Apollo 13. The original crew member, Ken Mattingly, was supposed to go on the Apollo 13 mission, but Swigert had to replace him after being exposed to a sickness called German measles. Jim Lovell was the most traveled astronaut. He had 572 spaceflight hours and 3 missions of experience. He also was part of the crew of Apollo 8, the first mission that had circled the moon. He also flew 2 German space missions. The third Apollo 13 crew member was Fred Haise, and he had been in the same astronaut class as Jack Swigert. He had also been a backup crew member of the Apollo 8 and 11 missions. Fred Haise, the outland pilot, was in the lunar module Aquarius, Jack Swigert, the CM pilot in the command module Odyssey, and Jim Lovell, the commander, also in the command module Odyssey. The service module was the location of where the oxygen tank exploded. Apollo 13 launched on April 11, 1970. The original objective was to go to the moon and land in the Fra-Mauro area to survey and sample Imbrium Basin, but was reassigned to landing safely back on Earth after the air tank exploded on the way there. Before the launch happened, the same oxygen tank in the spacecraft had been taken out for modifying and was damaged in the process. So they had to fix it and was even tested at the factory, but still caused an explosion in the spacecraft. When the crew was 200,000 miles from Earth and getting close to the moon, mission controller Cy Leibergott noticed a warning signal that said one of the oxygen tanks had a low pressure, which caused oxygen tank number 2 to blow up and affected number 1, causing it to fail. They had lost a supply of electricity, water, and light. A moment later, after Swigert had started the routine procedure, alarms had begun lighting up at Odyssey and oxygen pressure fell as power had disappeared too. The alarm and warning lights had symbolized a loss of 2 out of 3 fuel cells. Gas from the oxygen tank was escaping and flowing out from the spacecraft into space. Once the command module got into Earth's orbit as they soon dropped down into the Pacific Ocean near the island Samoa. The tragedy in Apollo 13 would be the oxygen tank exploding in the aircraft and them having to abort the mission after not making it to the moon. Even though it may not seem much of a triumph and more of a tragedy, it definitely is one. That's because this mission had made it back to Earth, even though it didn't complete the mission without anyone getting hurt or injured. This event had impacted NASA and their future space missions. It also impacted how they would look over the spacecraft and other things before they launched into space so nothing bad would happen. Apollo's 13 mission was also reassigned to Apollo 14. On board the spacecraft was Alan Shepard, Stuart Rosen, and Edgar Mitchell. The mission was assigned to Apollo 13's objective since it had failed. Apollo 14 was launched on January 31, 1971. The spacecraft successfully landed and the crew members became the 5th and 6th people to walk on the moon. Apollo 15 was launched on July 27, 1971. This video shows the launch from the moon. The crew members were David Scott, Alfred Worden, James Irwin. Budget cuts for Apollo 15 made them have to cancel the plans for a later mission, Apollo 18. So they went to the moon for more of a science-based reason. Apollo 16 launched on April 16, 1972. Crew members were John Young, Charles Duke Jr., and Ken Mattingly. Mattingly was originally assigned to Apollo 13, but was reassigned to this mission after having German measles. Lunar rover on this mission reached the highest speed for a vehicle with wheels on the moon, which is 11 miles per hour. The last and final Apollo mission to the moon was Apollo 17. This launched on December 7, 1972. Crew members on the spacecraft were Eugene Cernan, Ron Evans, and Harrison Schmitt. They set the record for the most time spent on the moon, which is over 22 hours. As you can see, most of these missions are successful, while a few others were unsuccessful. Apollo 13 was a successful failure because it had to abort the mission after an oxygen tank erupting, but landing back on the Earth. It was the overall most famous mission that NASA had launched and was very impactful.